Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Comics Lair for our discussion of comics as an object of nostalgia. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. I'll start by asking our panel to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they do and their interest in comics. Mike, will you start?
Sure. I'm Michael Kobre. I teach at Queen's University Charlotte. I'm a professor in the English department. I've been a comics fan for well over half a century. This is my cat Clementine. This is my feline advisor on all things literary and comics. I do scholarship about comics. I've got a piece in a collection called Superhero Bodies from Routledge Press. I've got a book coming out, an edited collection of essays coming out from University Press of Mississippi sometime in 2024, and some other pieces coming up in the journal Inks from the Comics Studies Society, and also another collection from University Press of Mississippi on the comics art of Jack Kirby. And I guess that's all I've got for now, and that is my comics rack in the back of my room right here.
I'm so jealous.
Spinner rack sighting.
It's my time.
Tim, will you pick up?
Oh, me? Okay. My name is Tim Young. I live in Tokyo. I teach English here. I'm also a longtime podcaster. For the longest time of Deconstructing Comics. It's a general comics podcast. My brother, who's also on this call, Paul, and I do a show called To the Bat Poles, which is about Batman 66. And I'm also doing a podcast about the manga Fullmetal Alchemist called The Law of Equivalent Exchange.
Okay, Bobby?
Hi, I'm Bobby Nash. I'm a writer. I do write comics. I also write novels and short stories and audio stuff, and I've dabbled in screenplays. I've been a comics fan since the early to mid 70s, I guess. When I was introduced to Spider-Man, and I was kind of hooked from there. I love comics. I love writing them. I love reading them. I love talking about them. So I guess I'm in the right place.
Okay, John?
Yeah, hi, I'm John B. Cooke. I'm editor of Comic Book Creator magazine. I originally edited Comic Book Artist magazine, which won 5 Eisner Awards. And I just came out with the Charlton Companion, which is a book on the history of the Derby, Connecticut publishing company. And right now working on a history of heavy metal and those kind of magazines, and writing books, doing magazines. Did a documentary with my brother on Will Eisner called Portrait of a Sequential Artist, which debuted at Tribeca in 2007. Been collecting since been a fan since 1971. I was a reader back when I was in single digits. So, but something happened, and that was Jack Kirby happened to me. And that changed my life, and just came back from the Big Apple Con from yesterday. And so I'm a little tired, but willing to talk comics. So here we are. Thank you.
Paul?
I'm Paul Young. I teach in film and media studies at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. I wrote a book, it's been 8 years ago now, called Frank Miller's Daredevil and the I've forgotten the title of my book. Frank Miller's Daredevil and the Ends of Heroism. That's it.
That sounds right.
For the Rutgers series, Comics Culture. And it was nominated for an Eisner in 2014. It did not win, but it was nominated. And I just wanted a T-shirt that said, boy, oh boy, I was nominated and I got this lousy T-shirt and I love it. But I teach comics and film, comics and graphic novels and cinema, and talk about adaptation and the ways in which the media are similar and dissimilar. And I have guests come in, Steve Bissett, who lives in the area because he used to teach at he grew up in the area, but he teaches or taught at the Center for Cartoon Studies. And so he and I used to trade lectures, but I think he'll probably still come and talk to my class this coming year, even though he's retired now. But anyway, glad to be here. Been collecting, not really collecting, I guess. Well, Tim and I did collect Hot Stuff and Richie Rich. to begin with. But sometime in the mid 70s, we discovered Spider-Man through Silver Age, a Silver Age collection that we'll talk about quite nostalgically pretty soon.
Well, and the Electric Company.
And that was it. We were completely smitten, and so that's what you see is what you get. We are eternal comics fans.
And those of you who've been here before know that I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books and independently publish several types of romance and the Outcast Station science fiction series that I co-write with Jeannie Adams. I've been a comics fan since I was 8 years old, and I remember a lot of the things that we're going to talk about this evening. So since the topic is comics as objects of nostalgia, maybe we should talk about what nostalgia is first. Some scholars define it as an idealized longing for a past that never was. Do you agree or disagree, Tim?
I don't know. My experience, I mean, in terms of, media that I, loved in the past, I don't think it was something that never was. I mean, I watched Batman. I loved Batman. I still love watching Batman. And compared to some of the other shows I watched as a kid, like, I don't know, if I watch the Munsters now, it's kind of disappointing. But Batman has another level that appeals to me as an adult, and on top of the nostalgia. But the nostalgia is still there, and I remember it well, watching it then. So I wouldn't say that it's a past that never was, at least in my case.
Okay, Bobby?
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. When I think back on these things nostalgically, it's not everything holds up as well, but it also transports you kind of to that time. Especially if stuff you enjoyed as a kid when your life was a little more innocent than it is. You didn't know what you know as an adult. There's kind of that memory that's associated with a lot of this stuff. When I think about the very first comics that I ever bought, the comics are cool and I like them, but it's also that memory of where I bought them, what I was doing, begging my mother to let me buy them, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of that gets tied to it, where the nostalgia of this thing I love is tied to a real world experience. And so that kind of elevates it a little bit, I think.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I'm always thinking about like what the nature of collecting is. What does it mean psychologically? Not that I really study it in any scientific or psychological way, other than to say it's an odd thing to be. We're different, as far as collectors go, and I wonder if it's a fear that the past is receding, and nostalgia in itself is it can be poisonous, I think, but also I was just talking to my brother about it yesterday, where we were at the convention, sitting at my booth, and it's that. Is it the fact that in the early 70s and the 70s and the late 60s that so much good stuff was coming out? Does that make it nostalgic to really appreciate it? So I don't know if I'm copping out with that answer, but it seems to me that there was just such a huge amount of quality material that was coming out at the time that I don't necessarily feel nostalgic for it, other than just an ongoing and constant appreciation for it, and an obsession too. So.
Paul?
I think when it's said that nostalgia is a sentimental feeling for a past that never happened, I think generally speaking that happens to other people, but not you. My past,
that's it.
I'm nostalgic for really happened. Yours, on the other hand, is completely wrong. Reading about fans of like Marvel Superhero Secret Wars, the first series from the mid 80s, and thinking how much I detested it when I was 15, 16 years old, because it seemed so crassly commercial. It was about action figures. It wasn't really about the characters that we'd come to love. It was like, going back to preschool compared to Claremont's X-Men stories from, the end of the 70s and early 80s, at least in my view. So, but nevertheless, people, fans are nostalgic for those comics because those were the first comics they read. They were sort of on the tail end of my childhood interest in comics. As I was, getting ready to go to high school and college, that stuff just didn't strike me as worthwhile. But it is, it's attached to scents. It's attached to events of your life at that time. These, items are, and they kind of interweave with them because they're not just like coins that we collect. They're stories. They're narratives about characters that we are called upon to care about. And if we're convinced that they're worth caring about, we care about them quite deeply. But as my father would say, and my father is Tim's father too, and he's an inveterate punner and has a terrible sense of humor. Nostalgia ain't what it used to be. It's something that I believe that we do imagine past to be better than they are, because frankly, if we were all 10-year-old children right now, we'd be wishing that we could drive. Right. We wouldn't be, sentimentalizing the moment in which we lived necessarily. We would be wishing that we had more, that we could be more like adults. So there is a kind of fantasy about this past being so, terrific and wonderful. But there is a pleasure in just sitting in that mental space and, recouping it in some way that I think is real in the imagination, even if it doesn't necessarily reflect in any accurate way the moment that we're remembering.
Mike?
I'm curious, with you guys being brothers, how does that work? I mean, because you shared this together, does that, the togetherness that you were doing, this was something you both were into, does that color your nostalgia of it?
Absolutely. For me, anyway. I mean, we collected together, and
we did many things together. we shared a lot of our interests.
Yes, we played with Mego, Batman, and Spider-Man action figures for quite a while, and
much longer than our mom ever thought we would.
Yes,
we really got our money's worth,
beyond all reason. But I think the relationship that I had with Tim, we made comics together, and so that made a difference as well. That we were funneling our enjoyment of comics into our own attempts to be cartoonists, at least at the ages of 10, 12, 13, 14. And that was a creative process that, even though we never collaborated, we would put comics together with my comics and Tim's comics in them, and we would read them to each other, and we'd read them to our friend whose older brother had, buckets of thousands and thousands of Silver Age Marvels and DCs, which is, another, again, a nostalgic moment we'll have to get back to. But I would say, fond memories of doing things with Tim has a lot to do with the, where comics send me. If I pick up a 1979 issue of the X-Men or Spider-Man or Fantastic Four, I will go, kind of straight back to that moment in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll agree with that.
Mike, definition of nostalgia?
Well, tough to back clean up after so many great things have been said already. I guess I do sort of reject the definition that you gave us, Nancy, of an idealized longing for a past that never was. I think that it's really helpful, the distinction that's been given already, to separate the nostalgia I experience personally from what I feel about the vague concept of nostalgia in the culture at large. And I guess I would share that idea that, well, my nostalgia is perfectly earned and absolutely real, and I'm not sure about the various forms of nostalgia that exist out in the culture. I mean, I'm sitting in a room now where I'm kind of surrounded by artifacts of my own nostalgia. And again, I'll point to that little comic book rack in the back of my room here, which is meticulously organized. I think of it as my own personal art installation, with comic books from the DC Comics from the early 60s on one side, Marvel Comics from the early 60s on the other, and then mid-60s and later from DC and Marvel on the other sides as well. And it's my little time machine that takes me back to my own past, which is, I think, about my own kind of experience of nostalgia. I recently read Douglas Walk's All the Marvels, which I thought was a interesting and a fun book. Kind of an annotated liner notes for greatest hits album, Marvel Comics. But he talks in the beginning of that about the person who was lucky enough to actually see all that stuff develop in real time. And that was me. I was born in 1957. So my very first awareness of comics was when I was first starting to see Marvel appear on the stands. And because of the sort of unreliability of the newsstand distribution system of that age, I recognized there was something special about those comics, but they were hard to find. I had a very particular geography of drugstores in Columbus, Ohio, where I knew I could find certain issues and where I wouldn't be able to find others. And of course, watching the kind of cultural importance that Marvel, for good and ill, has assumed in recent years, those kind of nostalgic sensations feel like they're leading me back to something really interesting and really important, and I'm still working that out. So that's probably a muddle of an answer, but I'll just stick with it.
Okay. Well, obviously, if you are nostalgic about something, we're drawn to it in the first place, in the long ago time that we're now nostalgic about. So what do you think draws young people to comics, or drew young people to comics in the era when you were first getting into them? And do you think that's changed over time? Bobby?
For me, my introduction came from reruns of the 60s Spider-Man cartoon. I would watch those after I'd get home from school. And so I was a fan of Spider-Man with no concept of comics. Where I realized that there were Spider-Man comics was us checking out at this department store we were in, and in the checkout aisle were these 3-packs, and there were 2 Spider-Man issues, and I couldn't see the one in the middle. And I remember, like, it was an aha moment for me. It's like, oh my goodness, I can read Spider-Man too. And so convincing my mother to let me buy that 3-pack, which apparently was one of those where I guess the store did it or some local distributor did it, because it was 3 consecutive issues of Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man. And I loved it. And I was hooked. I was hooked on the medium of comics. But like Mike said, because of how hard it was to find things sometimes, like the last, it was issues 192, 193, and 194. 194 ends on a cliffhanger. It was 10 years before I found out what happened next. I was hooked. I mean, the comics were just so much fun, and that kind of made me want to go find more. So,
sorry, Bobby, wasn't 194 the introduction of the Black Cat?
It was, yes, yes.
That's a cliffhanger, all right, at the end.
Yeah, and so, but it was great, and it's so funny. The first probably 5 or 6 comics that I ended up buying, and they weren't all Spider-Man, were all just coincidentally were all written by Marv Wolfman and drawn by Keith Pollard. So for a while, young Bobby thought those were the only 2 guys making comics. So yeah.
John, what do you think makes comics so attractive in the era when you were drawn to them, and do you think it's changed?
I don't think. I mean, the popularity of comics was plummeting when I got in 1970, 1971. Girls had left comics. Romance comics vanished. The only one that survived there were Archie's, and Archie's was one of the best-selling comics that were happening. I go back to my past. I had a dysfunctional childhood. Me and my brother found solace and great comfort in drawing and in comics. So that was it. That was extremely important to us because we found peace doing it. And we also moved to Europe for a while, which was amazing in one way to be exposed to so much different art. But we sought out, I don't know why, other than homesickness, we sought out comics. And that's when I became a fan. Is when there's a kind of a desperation, but it's mine, a possessive aspect to it. And then books opened, and then it was books, and then it was music, and then it was girls, and then it was so. But initially, it was again, it was like almost like a comfort food. And it wasn't so much the superheroes and the characters, other than I'm crazy for Captain America, just for reasons we need not get into. But it's for me. It very quickly we were able to go to Suling Cons, which was the New York comic art conventions, which were kind of the thing. They were bigger than San Diego at the time. They were the big shows to go to, and to be able to be there and to talk to Jack Kirby and to listen to Gil Kane and be awed by Jim Steranko and all these personalities in this very small community that it was at the time. We felt embraced. We felt like, and we immediately jumped into fandom and started our own fanzines. And it was just, the more that I think about it as I get older, how quickly it happened. Literally, from seeing an ad in Creepy, we were off to the summer convention, and I started a fanzine, and our lives are changed. And they simply had changed. And for me, it's always, my big debate has always been, it's the artist, not the artifact. I was immediately drawn to the people who did them rather than the characters or the storylines, as much as I admired a lot of that stuff. But it was the artists and the writers and eventually the editors that I became completely enamored with, that I'm still in awe of these people today. And that's why I celebrate them with my magazines and books.
So. Let's see. Remind me of the question exactly. I'm really getting engrossed.
Well, what do you think drew people into the comics when you got into them, and do you think that's changed?
Tim and I grew up in a very small town in a kind of depopulous state of the state of Iowa, and a town of about 5,000 people, and so nobody else was into comics that we knew. Almost nobody. We started out buying funnies and whatever funny animal comics we get hold of, because I don't know how Tim feels about this, but I felt as though comics were for me. If there was anything in mass culture that was actually aimed at me as a kid, it was comics. And so comics and cartoons didn't matter how cruddy they were. I wanted them. I wanted to see them. I wanted to ingest them, because it felt like somebody noticed me. I felt seen, as we would say today. Tim and I both started drawing, everywhere we could find, a place to draw comics, tiny notebooks, one panel per page. We would, be filling them in. But,
in church.
I'm not, aside from feeling as though I was the target audience, I'm not sure, there wasn't really any other incentive to get into comics, because I had no friends, even when we moved to a larger town, who had any interest in comics.
Or if they did, they hid it. It was
yes. If they did, they weren't telling.
You weren't proud to be a geek in those days.
No. Whereas Tim and I were, basically, proselytizers. We were the John the Baptist of Marvel, I suppose. But we got beheaded a good chunk of the time as well. So I think it's certainly not, being a geek is not uncool these days. I mean, there's even the Big Bang Theory to prove that there's a market for it, and people embrace their geekiness. But I have to go along with what John said, that before too long, Tim and I got interested in Marvel because we were introduced to Spider-Man by Tim's best friend's brother's collection from the Silver Age. And Spider-Man scared the crap out of me. I saw the Ditko Spider-Man and those gigantic eyes, and I had no idea what I was looking at. I'd never seen art like that before, but I was fascinated by it. And I think that grew into an interest in the artists, almost more than the characters at some points. Like when Frank Miller started working on Daredevil, I was interested in it because Frank Miller drew in ways that I'd never seen anyone draw before, and that really caught my attention. So I guess, for me, it started with the characters, and I, strongly identified with Peter Parker because I too was a complete nerd who never found a friends group when I was pretty young. But as I got older and, drew more, I realized that what really grabbed me was just wondering why the artists made the choices that they did. and what difference it would make to make a body expressive rather than realistic. That really caught my fancy, and so I'm sure there's still a fair amount of that. But comics are terribly expensive now, and they're kind of muddy looking to me compared to the very clear primaries and single colors of the newsprint era. I know, nostalgic for what probably feels like crud to our contemporaries, or not our contemporaries, but kids who are getting into comics now, if they do. But Tim and I got into comics at a time where comics were also kind of tanking. The end of the 70s was a pretty terrible time financially and economically for the comics industry, but we had no idea. We just thought it was thriving, and it was right before the direct sales kind of boom, which turned into a bust very shortly thereafter. So we just felt like we were lucky that there were so many comics standing around us waiting to be opened for a mere 35 and then 40 and then 50 and then 75 cents or 60 cents. Comics went up, in price about every 2 weeks there, and just the moment we began buying them.
Hard to budget.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Mike?
Well, as I think back to my childhood, again, growing up in Columbus, Ohio in the 1960s, I had no idea what might have appealed to other children about comics. I had a few friends who, sort of read them occasionally, but absolutely nobody had the kind of passionate, obsessive response that I had. And so it felt, it was my own private world and my own private language. I remember probably was at best 4 years old seeing the first rack of comic books ever in my life, which was at what we used to call a 5 and dime store. And I can still vividly remember, speaking of primary colors, there was an issue of The Flash, so the red costume of The Flash, and an issue of Mystery in Space with Adam Strange, with, the red costume and the jetpacks and the finned helmet. And I just thought that was the most amazing thing in the world. And then, of course, Marvel comics began to appear, and they were different in ways that I couldn't explain and couldn't classify, but they emotionally engaged me and obsessed me in a way that the comics that were more readily available, which I still enjoyed, just didn't engage me in that way. And speaking of Jack Kirby, I mean, obviously Kirby's art, aside from all the power of it, conveys so much emotion. So this is certainly a few years into my comics reading. Initially, it was just comics looking, because I bought them before I could read and just tried to follow the story from picture to picture. But I think it's Fantastic Four number 24, when you've got the second confrontation between the Thing and the Hulk, and the rest of the Fantastic Four all taken out. And it's the Thing by himself who's overpowered by the Hulk. And you've got, just amazing dramatic sequences that Kirby draws. And I found that just so emotionally unsettling to see the less powerful Thing keep trying to soldier on as he was beaten over and over again by Kirby's version of the Hulk. So those things all seemed completely private to me. And I think that the first time that I got a sense that there was a larger world that was connected to this, and I saw some advertisements in comics for people selling back issues, but that seemed hopelessly out of my price range. And the first time I saw that the wider world seemed to notice this, maybe aside from the Batman TV show and Spider-Man cartoons and things like that, but some sort of validation. In the early 1970s, the New York Times Magazine had a cover story on comics. It was something like, how comics are relevant. The cover featured a Joe Kubrick, Sergeant Rock. Yeah, based on the My Lai massacre. And Kirby had just started the Fourth World Series and was prominently featured in that. And that was the first time I saw, wait a minute, there's some sort of recognition that there's something in this form that maybe has some value beyond my own private obsessions. So I was completely in a vacuum up until that time, and didn't attend my first comic book convention until sometime in the early 1980s, when I was in graduate school and just happened to drop in on them.
Tim?
Well, I'm not sure what drew other people to comics. Maybe, the idea of if we're talking about superhero comics, these continuous stories were attractive, interesting. I'm thinking about my attraction just to the medium of comics. It goes, way back. And I think for me, a lot of it was that the best thing I could think of in the world was watching animated cartoons on TV. But I was born in 1965, and so in the early 70s, we had no home video, we had no cable TV other than just for our small market to be able to bring in other all three networks. We had cable TV for that purpose, and so I couldn't watch cartoons whenever I wanted to, and so the next best thing was to read comic books, because it was kind of like watching a cartoon whenever you wanted to. And it was a lot of the same characters. I was thinking about my earliest comic reading and nostalgia yesterday, and I think for me that my interest in the comics medium goes back to reading Peanuts, and I was been reading the Fantagraphics Peanuts books lately because I got interested in a podcast called Unpacking Peanuts, where they're going through the series. And I was reading 1968, and the first half or so of 1968 was collected in 68 in a book called You're You, Charlie Brown, which somehow ended up in our house within 1968. And I was 3 years old, couldn't read yet, but I think somebody was reading them to me. And I don't know, reading those comics now, it's like, I have a much stronger feeling about those Peanut strips than any other Peanut strips, because this is like the most foundational, basic comics in my life. And I not just remembering, reading those comics, but what I felt about them at the time, or how I might have misunderstood them at the time, or whatever. So, but yeah, I think, the drawing was interesting, and my dad was into it. That was a plus. And he would quote from those strips in that book. So there's actually a little bit, unusually for the time, some community by reading comics. Oh, my dad is into it too. Okay. And my brother, when he was old enough. So yeah, there is at least within our family, kind of a fellowship related to comics.
I think a lot of the kids who were reading comics when I first got into them in grade school were primarily reading them for the sense of adventure that they got from it. Go to distant places, identify with a character who can do things that you can't do. For me, it was a little bit more than that, because I was a nerd child, and I was always growing, and I was surrounded by people who were outdoorsy and athletic. And it didn't matter that I wasn't good at climbing trees, and frankly was a little bit scared of it. And it didn't matter that I didn't have foot speed. I could zoom through the sky with Superman. I could swing from buildings with Batman. And a lot of it was escapism for me, although I was also drawn to the characters, and I'm still drawn to the characters. And I think that's why I get mad when I feel like the new writer on a book hasn't read anything that came before. And that may not be fair to the writer. Maybe they have. It's just they don't write the character the way I remember the character. And that's probably my nostalgic fondness for that first version of the character, because my Star Trek will always be the original series. My Star Wars will always be A New Hope. My Stargate will always be SG-1. And so I think maybe I'm just a little bit like that I just glom onto things and stick with them. But hearing what you all have said as we've gone around, it really seems like a range of comics readers and collectors. And so how did those feelings echo when you do the comics related things you do now? Are you still feeling a little bit of what you felt way back when you first got into it? John?
Yeah, if I may, I just want to back up just a teeny bit, and because I realized when I was a kid, and we moved around a lot for a certain period of time, and I really got into Dr. Dolittle. I mean, because I discovered that there were at least a dozen, if not 18, different volumes of these these wonderful adventures. These absolutely charming thing. It was perfect for a 9-year-old or 10-year-old when I was reading it. And I was drawn, and then I was drawn to Tom Sawyer. And believe it or not, Tom Sawyer, of course, was in Huckleberry Finn ever so briefly. But there was also that Mark Twain had done these Tom Sawyer Detective and Tom Sawyer Abroad, and he'd done these cheapy quickies to make some money. I later learned, but I was enthralled with it, and I think that a part of it was a sense of that there was continuity, that these characters existed from book to book, and they were the same characters. They were the characters I invested my emotional attachment to. And I think that that's a real big part of the superhero comics, of getting into them, because they didn't die. They didn't go away. They didn't divorce the family. There was always this continuity and going on. And I think you could have done that with a mystery book or a romance book. But superheroes tend to be very exciting. And they have very exciting adventures that they go into outer space and into other dimensions. And I think that was an important thing, that it's not, I wasn't attracted, I don't think, into the physicality of them being muscled and this kind of, I don't know, subconscious attraction towards the musculature or anything like that. So much as that was a genre that could carry our attention, to carry it over into other into the characters. And if I can say, dude, the minute that there was this Justice League of America and that there was this cross universe that was taking place, that Jack and Stan and Steve Ditko took advantage of, that was it. I mean, then there's a universe. It's not only one title with Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane along with Clark Kent and Superman. You're talking about, the 3 streets over in Queens, there's Spider-Man, and there's the Baxter Building in Midtown Manhattan. And I mean, that was just like amazing, especially when they called it not Central City, but they called it New York. When they called it someplace real, and I was connected. I was just emotionally connected with these characters, and that continuity is, I just think, very important. And what was your question?
That's okay. The question was, do you get an echo of those feelings that first drew you in when you do the comics related work that you do now?
It's joy. I mean, I am a critical thinker, and I like to think I am. I'm relatively intelligent. I know good stuff from bad. I know good movie people who produce movies. I certainly know good comics from bad. But the form is something I still feel really excited about, like I did when I was 10 years old, 12 years old. When I first realized, looking through a reprint of Challenges of the Unknown, and realizing that this is the same guy who did, some other comic books. This was a reprint of some other comic book. It's just joy. I mean, and I still have it all the time, but I'm able to transfer that also. Mystified why people work in this industry that is so bad to them, that they get so poorly paid. And when I'm able to celebrate their lives and to interview them at length and all that, and show them attention, really show any number of people attention, and even in death, long after they passed away, that I'm able to do this, it feels immensely gratifying because I'm able to give back. So, joy.
And that history is so incredibly valuable. I mean, it's I just can't overstate the importance of that information.
Paul?
Oh, so many thoughts, so many feelings flooding back. I feel like my spider sense is tingling. The Daredevil book that I wrote about, Frank Miller's work on the book from 79 to 82 or 3. Sorry, I don't have the years in front of me right now. I put myself back in that moment because there was no other way to find the thread. I sort of, was able to start thinking about what was different about his work from what had happened with, Daredevil in the first 156 issues or 157 issues, by basically going back to the moment where I picked a book off the rack and said, "What in God's name is this?" The issue in which the Hulk beat the snot out of Daredevil, which was a kind of homage to the moment where the Submariner, excuse me, I still call him the Submariner all these years. That's just because we called him that when we were like 8. But the Submariner, beat the snot out of Daredevil in like issue 7 when Wally Wood was at the helm, and it was that was Frank Miller's Daredevil, was this this character who had no special abilities beyond the fact that his senses were heightened. But he would take on the Hulk because he felt like he had to. And, that really did something to me because, listening to all of you talking about your identification with the heroes, I remembered, I wanted to be Spider-Man. I would close my eyes and pretend that I was Spider-Man. I wanted to be able to swing and, I'd have this, amazing strength and be able to stick to walls. But I would fantasize about that quite a bit. But with Daredevil, this is just a guy, a guy who bleeds and bleeds all over the place in Frank Miller's imagination and on the page. So I really had to get back into that headspace of what it was that kind of clicked for me when I saw that work for the first time. And in fact, I made a mistake, I think, in that book. I wrote an entire chapter from the perspective of myself as a 13-year-old, having read Daredevil 181, the death of Elektra story, where Bullseye kills Elektra, and then Daredevil accidentally or on purpose maims Bullseye, who killed his the love of his life. I turned it into a catechism where I am talking, back to the catechism and sort of answering questions, because our father was a pastor. And when I was in confirmation class and he was always teaching it, I was like filling in, the margins with, a billion pictures of Spider-Man's head while we were, doing the, catechetical memorization and all of that. So I've got, I'm being asked questions like in the catechism, and I'm responding to them regarding this Daredevil comic. And I do think it was a mistake insofar as people didn't get it, but I also had to do it in order to write the book. I had to get that out of my system, to kind of get back into that 13-year-old headspace. So, I really went over the edge when it comes to that moment for myself. But when I teach comics and graphic novels and cinema, I find myself trying to avoid that because it, and maybe I shouldn't, but avoiding that kind of emotional connection to the comics, I let the energy come out in my energy for teaching the material rather than trying to sentimentalize, the work or, try to convince people that it's good. These 18, 19, 20-year-old students. But, I think the energy comes out, that way, the fascination and the childlike energy and, obsession with the comics kind of comes out in the energy I have to like get the students to notice that there is such a thing as closure, between one panel and the next. And, they have to do an enormous amount of work to read a comic. They have to work with the artist and the writer in ways that no other medium requires them to. It's a kind of collaboration all the time that's led by masterful creators, but still it's led rather than just produced. So I guess that's where I am. Is a little bit of a seesaw. Did I go too far? Did I not go far enough? And kind of tapping into my childhood energies and emotions and memories. But I think I need at least some of that in my present work in order to be authentic about my interest and about the kind of analyses that I do with my students.
Michael?
Yeah, where to start here? I think I spend a lot of time in both my writing and to a lesser degree in my teaching, still trying to unpack that emotional connection I felt when I was reading some of these stories for the very first time. Just in talking about some of the attractions of the superhero genre, and again, I'm going to hone in on Marvel for just a moment, that one of the things that I felt as a child and continue to feel as I became more sophisticated, or somewhat more sophisticated at least, as a reader and a consumer of this material, is that what drew me to those characters, and this is a cliche to say about Marvel's characters, is the sense of them as sort of monstrous figures who were defined by their sense of difference and defined by their sense of alienation. And that's certainly something that at some kind of half-conscious level, at best, I picked up on as a child. And I think I've spent a lot of time trying to understand that now. Some of what I thought I saw in those comics, and I've written about in a couple of different venues, was a sense of a reflection of my own experience growing up in the Jewish community in Columbus, Ohio, and still feeling in the early 60s like we were fairly ghettoized in our experience, and seeing somehow this kind of transfigured reflection of that in those Marvel comics. A lot's been written about the Jewish influences on the industry and the Jewish background of the creators, and a lot of that I think is oversimplified. But I do think there's something there, and that's so as I approach this material now, some of what I'm doing, this is scholarship mostly, is trying to understand that emotional connection and where that power came from. Just been working on an essay about the presentation of Submariner, I called him that too, or Submariner, in Kirby's early issues of Fantastic Four, about the first third of the series, till about issue number 33, and trying to understand the power of that character who seems symbolically to represent kinds of difference and alienation. So that draws me back to it. In terms of my teaching, I'm with Paul in terms of trying to balance some expression of, well, here's the power that I felt when I first encountered this, but also, of course, being able to step back and take a more critical, more scholarly approach to the work as well. And I think that personal energy, though, is really essential, and it brings something to the conversation that my students appreciate, but you can't stay trapped in that particular space. It's a place to refer to and draw energy from, but it's got to inform a different kind of discussion. Well, so I'm right with Paul on that, and I can't wait to read that chapter in your Daredevil book. It just sounds fabulous, and excited to look at it. I love that idea.
Be gentle.
Oh, I love it. Yeah,
I'd love to read your work too. I haven't run into it in the past, and you know, somebody with a cat who is that gorgeous must be a really good person as well as a great, comic scholar.
There we go. I get it all from her.
Yeah.
So do I still feel those feelings from when I was a kid now? Well, certainly when watching Batman 66, yes. It's always there if I'm watching an episode. Of course, we've gone, beyond anything that I knew about as a kid, on our podcast. Talking, lots of things that we didn't know back then or wouldn't have understood. Deconstructing Comics podcast, I think maybe not as much, because we're talking about lots of different comics that maybe I didn't know or didn't exist yet when I was a kid. And also I think it's interesting. We'll talk about how comics work as a storytelling medium. As a kid, that just seemed intuitive. I never really thought about how comics worked. They just worked. I just read it and I looked at the pictures and I got the story.
I had the darndest time learning to talk about them in a scholarly way because I just think, well, there it is.
See, read it. See,
how can you not understand how this works?
I didn't have a sense then of how comics could be done poorly, where you didn't understand what they were trying to get across to you. So I don't know. I think with Deconstructing Comics, it's kind of gone beyond those feelings from when I was a kid. Or I don't know, if I have occasion to make comics, which I haven't in a while, then I think that feeling is kind of there.
Okay, Bobby?
Yeah, when I write, it gets there. Like when I first see pages of art come in from the artist, that kind of feeling is there of the excitement of discovering a story or discovering a comic or holding the finished product in my hand, the finished book in my hand, and looking at it and going, this is really cool. And as you're flipping through it, you forget it's something you did. You just get into the story. So yeah. So in those cases, I do kind of rediscover some of that feeling. Having also been able to write pre-existing characters that I grew up either watching or reading kind of gives me that too, like getting to write Zorro or getting to write the Green Hornet or Kolchak or the Lone Ranger, which those were characters I've gotten to write. Being able to do that kind of also summons up those feelings of what I loved about those when I first discovered them. What you have to be careful of is, because you'll see elements in what I write, you can kind of tell when I became a fan of them. Like if I was to write Spider-Man, it would probably have a 70s, 80s feel to it. But you also, you can't just, what is it? The happens so often with creative change, team changes, everything you knew was wrong, and we're going back to this version we liked. So that happens a lot. So you have to kind of be careful when you're doing that, not to fall into that trap, because sometimes nostalgia can go a little too far, and you kind of you can take steps backwards. But yeah, getting to play with these characters, and yeah, that's a lot of fun for me, and it does remind me of what got me to loving those characters in the first place when I was a kid.
Well, the main work that I do that's affiliated or directly involved with comics is I'm the comics track director for ConTinual. So I take the lead in figuring out what we're going to talk about for the next 3-month period. And it's guided a lot by things that I still have affection for that I had in the first place all those years ago. But I also have to stop and think, okay, there are more viewers than you. So you have to pick things that other people will enjoy as well, even if I don't particularly enjoy them. And that's been educational for me, because like, what's out there and what could we do with it and how could we explore it? But when I get into particularly the DC books, because that's what I grew up reading, I didn't read any Marvel till I hit college, that same affection comes out and I really enjoy it. But at the same time, I kind of have to guard against it, because I can't get too carried away with it, because we need to have a variety of programming, not just the Nancy's Greatest Hits favorites. So we are coming up on time.
Well, there's also something about to be said about like what we're doing here. We're a bunch of people that don't all know each other, but we're having this great conversation about comics. The comics is a thing that's kind of the thread that kind of ties us all together here. And I love that. I love being able to meet other people who are fans of comics or fans of particular comics. Like I know Jack Kirby's been mentioned a lot here. I love Kirby's work. So it's great being able to talk to people that also have an affinity for Kirby's work, or, different things like that. So, and I think sometimes nostalgia helps in that case too, because especially if you're talking to someone who read the same books you did, like if I talk Fantastic Four with someone who's 20, who's only read, the last 20 years worth, we can still geek out over the fact that we like the Fantastic Four, but the reasons we like the Fantastic Four are probably a little different, that kind of thing. So I think comics is a great way to do that. It's certainly it's less, I think Tim said earlier, people didn't really say they read comics. Whereas now, I knew comics hit the mainstream when my mother called me one day and says, okay, explain this Thor guy to me. I knew at that point comics had transcended some kind of barrier, because my mother. How
strange it is to live in an age where Thor is a household name. I mean,
I know, right?
Expected it.
Yeah. Well, we're
or Iron Man.
We've got about 5 more minutes. So is there anything that anybody wants to talk about or to say that we haven't already touched on?
Yeah, just thinking about I think something Bobby said about being careful about not getting too overwhelmed with nostalgia. I do think it's worth thinking about the way nostalgia affects the medium itself, because is there any popular medium more than, and I'm going to I guess limit this to mainstream superhero comics, that it sometimes is driven so much by nostalgia and loving, informed, sometimes not so loving and not so informed recreations or evocations of stories and arcs and work by artists in the past. So how much nostalgia drives the medium itself, how much that's also affected by the demographics of the audience now that's maybe going to the stores every week and on Wednesday. Me.
Yeah. Well, I think in addition to comics, I would certainly say probably things like Star Trek and Star Wars, with all the people doing fan films and things like that, cosplayers getting into that. I think those probably have that. And I'm sure there are more, but I mean, those, yeah, there's a big love for these properties, and it's kind of the beauty of it. There are people that can like, this person's Iron Man was drawn by Don Heck. This person's Iron Man is the guy in the movies. So, but it's still, you're both Iron Man fans. And so there's like that common ground to talk about these things.
We could actually do a panel on what's the difference between discovering superheroes through comic books and discovering them through cartoons, movies, video games. And that's a whole panel in itself. But I'm afraid we are coming up on time. So let's go around again. And if each of you will tell people if you have a website, an online presence anywhere where people can find information about your work. If you have a new, upcoming, or recent project you'd like to highlight, this is the time to do that. And Michael, we'll start with you.
Well, I'm kind of a dinosaur, so no websites, no, my online presence is fleeting. I've got, hopefully, all things working out, manuscripts coming in on time, sometime in 2024. Got an edited collection, I mentioned this before, coming out from University Press of Mississippi called Secret Identities, comic superheroes and counterpublics, and it'll be a set of, as I said, an edited collection of essays from various authors, and we're combining personal narratives and critical analysis, talking about, and I suppose there's some nostalgia involved here, that sense of the various scholars and writers in the book, how we as readers, at times feeling like ourselves as members of different kinds of outsider communities, found that reflected in different kinds of superhero comics, defined very broadly. So 2024, just keep hanging on. Sometime that year, all things willing, it will actually come out.
Okay. Tim?
So everything I'm doing, you can find links from timyoungonline.com, including, all the podcasts. And I wanted to mention, since Kirby has come up several times, that on Deconstructing Comics, we've been going through his early 70s DC work that I'd never read before, and I think Emmett hadn't read most of it before either. We finished The Fourth World. We talked about the Demon. We're working on Commandy now. By the time this video comes out, I think we'll have at least one Commandy episode up. So come listen to us talk about Jack Kirby.
Bobby?
Yes, I have stuff coming out fairly regularly. BobbyNash.com is my website. I'm on Facebook at author Bobby Nash, Twitter at Bobby Nash, Bobby Nash Writes on Instagram. I do have comics writing. For me is kind of one of those feast or famine things. I'll go a couple of years with no comic gigs, and then I'll get a bunch of them. So like I wrote 18 comics last year that will be out sometime. I don't know when. The publishers haven't given me dates yet, but so yes, there are comics coming. So I was a happy boy. I got to, get into. I it's still my first love of writing comics. So yeah.
Okay, John.
You can go to tomorrows.com, TWOMORROWS.com. I do Comic Book Creator magazine. That's quarterly. That is available through previews or that website. I've got right now I'm co-writing a history of Pacific Comics, which is quite interesting. I've got that heavy metal thing coming out. I'm doing not a new edition of the Warren Companion, but something akin to that called the Book of Warren. And I did the Book of Weirdo, so I'm kind of all over the place. I did a new a revival of Slow Death comics. I did those with Last Gasp. So mainstream and underground and alternative, and I like being all over the place. I guess that's about it. So,
Thank you. And Paul.
Well, I was chair of my department for 3 years, and so my productivity has really, really gone down the tubes. But I'm struggling my way back out of that hole right now. My Daredevil book from Rutgers is still on sale. You can get it through Amazon, although I think it's going through a new print run now. So it may be a while before new copies are available, but they still have used copies there. If you'd like to drop me a note, you can look me up on the dartmouth.edu website. And I do have my own website, but it's really just, a place where we describe, work that we've done, work that we're doing. And if you're unable to find Tim's website and you'd like to listen to the Bat Polls, there is a link to the Libsyn address on
to thebatpolls.libsyn.com.
Yes, that's it. I just wanted to say one last thing is that you've got me thinking when thinking about fans, Bobby, about how fandom, or how the creators are affected by their own nostalgia. John Byrne's Fantastic Four from the 1980s is one of those moments where he believed he was recreating, a version of Kirby and Lee. And what he found out very quickly was that his version of Kirby and Lee was not everybody's version of Kirby and Lee, which is very interesting. It's fascinating to think of that through that like third generation of post Silver Age creators. The generation after Roy Thomas, where these are the kids who grew up as fans of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, etc. And how they reacted and built their own work on those, their own nostalgia and love for those comics is a pretty fascinating question that has yet to be really addressed very deeply, I think, by scholarship anyway.
And you can find me here on ConTinual a lot of the time. My website is nancynorthcott.com. My next release is The King's Champion, which is the third volume in the Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy set during the summer of 1940 and the Battle of Britain. Thank you to everybody on the panel for being here for this discussion. Thank you for watching, and thanks to our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. For more information, visit heroesonline.com.
And thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.